It is day one of the COA 9 NAEU qualifiers, and Prototype is hoping to upset Team Omni, who has qualified multiple times for the international tournament. However, what we instead got was a 2-0 sweep, defined by incredibly weird and wacky choices. So, how did a team that a lot of people were high on lose so badly? Now, two quick disclaimers before we get into the video. The first is that this video is not meant to be an insult against Prototype. It is purely to serve as analytical insight in one of the matches during the qualifiers. The second is that I've been made aware of Omni's actions whilst writing the script, and I will make it incredibly clear that this video is not meant to endorse nor promote Omni, and that I do not side with the team at all. In fact, this will likely be the last time I mention the team's name in this video. Anyways, the video is not about these teams, but rather how Banfix can divide a match. Oftentimes, we think that all it takes to be the best team in the world is to be mechanically better than your opponents. But Identity V is not just a game of mechanics, but a game of minds, and Banfix best described this. You see, COA 9's meta is diverse and different depending on who you ask. Most characters are often viable, BO1 picks are not well defined, and teams are still attempting to figure out what works and what doesn't. However, that doesn't mean that ban picks can't be optimized. Let's start on Prototype's ban picks on round 1. In the first half, most of it was generally standard. After the Seer and Enchantress ban, Magician and Puppeteer were selected. And while Archer may have been the better choice to secure a harasser, it's not that big of a deal, especially if the team might not have one that can play at a proficient level. However, after Antiquarian was banned, Pharaoh Lady was selected. Now, my understanding of this pick is stemmed from two key reasons. First is that apparently the team had the number one Pharaoh Lady in NAEU server. The second stems from the fact that the opposing hunter had a history of playing Ivy at a top level. Regardless, these reasons fall flat for a couple of reasons. Pharaoh Lady could have likely been saved in later rounds as she actually becomes a legitimate threat once key characters like Goatman is no longer available. And by picking her up so early on, they basically allowed the opposing team to remove one of Prototype's mains while also being able to play a counter against it. If the concern was on Ivy, other options were still available, the primary one being Doctor, and it might have been simply safer to play flexible characters like Meteorologist instead of forcing the Pharaoh pick. Moving forward, their hunter side was actually decent at the start. The bans were pretty fine, and it was leaning towards a potential Ivy pick, which isn't the greatest pick at a map like Lakeside, but completely viable and playable as we've seen in pro play. Instead, what we saw was an Anne pick, and this just makes no sense. The main reason you'd pick Anne in this instance is three reasons. The first is comfort, the second is composition, the third is to remove the potential point deficit. Comfort is unfortunately not enough of a reason to be selecting Anne this early, and similar to the points made with Pharaoh Lady, could have been preserved to either force the ban from the opposing team or pick it when you actually need the tie. The composition was neither bad nor good in an Anne matchup, and the only real reason you'd be selecting Anne this early is if the composition was filled with four characters that Anne eats alive, which is unfortunately not the case. The third reason is reducing point deficit. This actually would make sense because perhaps there's a certain fear that if he played for a win, he could potentially risk a loss and give additional points to the opponent. By selecting Anne, it does allow them to play for a win in later rounds. Unfortunately, this doesn't track because of that Pharaoh Lady pick. At that point, they have given perhaps one of their trump cards in the game, so aiming for a tie would potentially put their survivors at a disadvantage following the next few rounds. Additionally, the same reasoning can be used to play Peddler or Wax Artist, which are significantly better picks, with Peddler even having potential win conditions. By picking Anne, you've basically locked yourself in a scenario where you'll almost always lose the first round, and unfortunately, a 5 Cypher Kite was definitely not what Prototype needed. The second round was a bit better hunter-wise. Although banning Lantern probably should have been a priority over Fire Investigator, it is still a decent ban. Hullabaloo wasn't well received primarily because this was 18-second nerf Hulla, but I actually think this pick was fine because the opponent's weakness as a team, not their composition, comes from their rescues, and we see that soon as Gardener gets double downed. However, I don't think the same can be said with their survivors. Now they banned Peddler, which the commentators weren't high on, but I thought was completely reasonable. We're seeing the character dominate in Japan as of recording this video, so it's a reasonable ban. What is interesting, however, was selecting Psychologist this early. Doesn't make a lot of sense as it could have been picked a lot later. Even if it was banned, Doctor and Barmaid is still available and therefore they would always have priority in that case. Fire Investigator could have also worked in this situation too. If they were simply worried about Dream Witch, I'd actually be fine with banning it since Fire Investigator has good matchups against all remaining meta hunters. Regardless, picking Psychologist this early doesn't make a lot of sense. Coordinator was banned next, and they picked Meteorologist, which is totally fine. Then Fire Investigator was banned, and out of nowhere, they selected Novelist. And this doesn't make sense at all. They banned Peddler and still picked Novelist, which makes me assume that they were so worried on a Dream Witch pick that never happened. It would have been just way better if they selected Antiquarian or Gardener because Novelist is too weak against Ivy, which was then selected. I genuinely think that this BP comes from a fear of Dream Witch. This explains why Psychologist was prioritized, why Gravekeeper was selected over Escapologist, and why Novelist was selected as a counter against Dream Witch leeches. However, this just made them too weak to other meta options, specifically Ivy that can quickly deal with Novelists in the early game. Now, it's quick to judge Prototype based on their band picks alone, but they were actually doing pretty decent despite the picks being rather suboptimal. Both their survivor matches had type potential that just wasn't properly capitalized, and while that hullabaloo match became dangerous, the opponent's inability to rescue was quickly capitalized to secure a solid tie. And that leads to my point. In my opinion, Prototype had the skill to win this match and potentially qualify. But what led to such a quick 0-2 was because their picks were simply unoptimized. The video is titled How Band Picks Define a Match because this match is an example of how a team had the makings of a championship roster, but it was their bad picks that quickly caused their demise.